Hi, my name is Jessica Stroop. Today I'm going to be presenting on disabled mothering. This is going to be for partial completion of a final exam in sociology of the family with Dr. Ellen Lamont. So to begin, our guiding questions for the day are: how do disability and ableism affect motherhood? What challenges and dilemmas do disabled mothers face? What solutions do disabled mothers use to effectively mother? And finally, what further sociological research is needed to improve disabled mothering? So to begin, I think that it is important that we clearly define what is disability. So we're going to be looking at what disability is through two different lenses. The first is going to be the medical lens, and that is that disability is a condition of the mind or body that makes it more difficult for the individual with the condition to participate in certain activities and interact within society. The second lens or definition is going to be from a sociological perspective, and that is that disability is broadly conceptualized as a product of environment. It considers structural processes that shape the meaning and experience of disability. So whereas medical disability is more interested in the condition of what the individual has, the sociological perspective is more interested in the experience of the person. So how does society react to disability? And how does disability affect society? It can go both ways. So I think next what's important to look at is also what is ableism and how does ableism affect disability, and together how do disability and ableism affect motherhood. So ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. So these two definitions are going to be very useful to us as we continue to study what disabled motherhood looks like and how society reacts to disabled motherhood. But before we talk about what is disabled motherhood and how does society react to it, I think it's important to first talk about some general pressures on mothers. So whether you are a disabled mother, an able-bodied mother, a woman of color who is a mother, a single parent, what are the pressures that mothers face in today's society? So first we will look at intensive mothering, and in the radio show Air Talk, a group of sociologists that include Miller, LaRoe, Downing, and others talk about intensive mothering. And it is a new form of parenting, a new form of mothering that is very intentional. So in this kind of mothering, it's not enough for children just to be able to play. There has to be intention behind the play. There has to be some lesson that can be learned. Children can't just go outside and run around and play. There has to be some element of learning. And so where this gets tricky for women with disability while they are mothering is, say for example, they try to go to a playground with their child. Very common occurrence with mothers. Where it gets difficult for women with disabilities is often playgrounds are not accessible. There's gravel or mulch that makes it difficult to access when there are mobility issues. And that's specifically for women with physical disabilities, where an intensive mother would be expected by society to play on the playground with her child. And where disabled mothers tend to fall short of that is that because of the lack of accessibility and the lack of access, society sees that disabled mothers fail at intensive mothering. And so in that regard. And so as a response, women with disabilities often turn to inventive mothering. And Jennifer Randles talks about this in her research of what inventive mothering is. And the concept of inventive mothering is mothers who do not have either economical or time resources to be able to intensely parent the way society thinks that they should. So they have to get creative in the way that they mother to be able to prove to society that their mothering ability is just as effective as a intensely mother who parents intensely. And the third component that we will talk about as far as pressures on mothering, and this is particularly important to disabled mothers, is state surveillance. So oftentimes those mothers who are participating in inventive mothering, like I said, do not have financial resources to be able to intensely parent, and therefore are often either mothers of color or mothers in a service class. And they often are involved with social services. And so where this comes into play with disabled mothers is because of ableism. There are instances where disabled mothers are reported for being bad mothers simply because of their disability. And disabled mothers are much more prone to being surveyed by the state. So one of the things, the first thing that we'll talk about with disabled mothering particularly is the challenges that disabled mothers face. And so kind of going back to that state surveillance that I mentioned earlier, women that do have disabilities are more susceptible to being surveyed by the state, and that comes from safety concerns from others. Angela Frederick, in an article she authored called Mothering While Disabled, illustrates this with a newborn baby who is in the hospital with her mother after being born and ends up being a ward of the state because both of her parents are blind. And despite being able to answer all of the social worker's questions, because of how that they would plan to parent their child, how that they would take care of their child, the baby was taken into custody because it was deemed by the social worker that she could not in good conscience send an infant home with blind parents. And that was very ableistic of her, a very ableistic viewpoint, because she could not understand how they could participate in inventive mothering or inventive parenting and be able to safely and effectively care for their child. Other challenges that come into play for disabled mothers are finding a medical provider that is willing to see them, willing to treat them. We'll talk about this a little bit in the next section, but mothers with disabilities are often looked down upon by medical providers and are often discouraged from having a child. And so bodily autonomy is a hot topic in sociology and in society, and this often comes into play when we talk about abortion and like the woman's right to either carry a child to term or to terminate a pregnancy. Well, how it's involved with disabled mothering is often that bodily autonomy is taken away from a mother because of a perceived risk because of the disability. And so the second kind of portion that we'll talk about here with these challenges that come up with mothers trying to find safe medical providers that they feel comfortable with, that are willing to treat them. There's also a dilemma that disabled mothers face. And so that often comes into, okay, well, I am a woman with a disability and I am thinking of having a child. Do I want to have to spend the emotional resources or emotional energy to constantly advocate for myself and for my child? Oftentimes, people with disabilities are having to prove themselves all the time and have to educate others in society of disability and what that looks like. There's often feelings of responsibility, of like, well, is it responsible of me to have a child because of those perceived genetic risk? Like, is it responsible to bring in a child into this world who could face similar challenges because of physical disability? There's also dilemmas using genetic services. Oftentimes, genetic services and genetic counseling can be a great benefit to women with disability. But because of the history of eugenics in the United States and the ableistic view that disability should be fixed or eradicated, there's often hesitancy in using genetic services, even when those services could prove useful and beneficial. There's also the dilemma of, like I said, having to educate, but you're educating on dependency versus nurturing. And so oftentimes people in society will see a woman who is disabled as dependent. And because they are dependent, that automatically makes them unable to be nurturing. And so where women have to kind of balance this tightrope of being able to educate people in society, educate policy in society, is that just because there is dependency does not mean that there cannot be nurturing. And so that's where disabled mothers come up with counter narratives and solutions to how that they would mother effectively. So as I mentioned earlier with inventive mothering, it is by default that women with disability mother inventively. Because oftentimes there is no other choice. And they create counter narratives to prove that they are able to parent safely and effectively and kind of live up to those societal norms of intensive parenting and what a safe and effective parent should look like. And so in her article, Ramp to Motherhood, sociologist, her name is Przinski, I believe is her name, Prlinsky. She talks about different solutions that disabled mothers come up with. So one of the solutions that she talked about and studied in her article was that a disabled mother that she interviewed worked tirelessly to find an accessible playground so that she could intensely parent her child. But the playground that she was forced to go to was across town, a 30-minute drive. But she was willing to do that to prove to society that she was a good and effective and intense mother. So what can we do about the way that disabled women are viewed in society and the way that society looks at disabled motherhood? The first thing is that further research needs to be done into disabled mothering. In doing this research, I could only find about 10 articles. Most of the research that has been done is parenting a child with a disability, not parenting as someone with a disability. And so with this further research, policy changes could be able to be made because there would be a greater awareness of the disabled experience and what that looks like. So thank you so much for listening and for being a participant in this research, and I hope you learned. Thank you.